He had come to the mountains looking for silence, trying to shut out the noise of a life made of orders, gunfire, and decisions that allowed no margin for error. He was a Navy SEAL on 30 days of leave who only wanted to breathe cold air and forget, if only for a moment, the names of cities that smelled of gunpowder and sweat. But the night the storm hit Silver Ridge, Colorado, he understood that some kinds of violence don't let go so easily. As the wind began to howl like a wounded animal and snow slammed into the trees with fury, he went out to secure his isolated cabin, checking the shutters, the generator, the firewood, everything with that automatic calm that never fully leaves you. When he was about to go back inside, something made him stop, that old feeling in his gut he couldn't explain but that was almost always right. He grabbed the powerful flashlight hanging by the door and swept its beam across the forest as it began to vanish under the snow. He was only trying to confirm he had enough firewood to avoid going out for days, but then he saw something that didn't belong, a dark shape half buried near the edge of his property, too small to be a log, too still to be a living animal. In that instant, rest shut off and the operator came back online. He moved slowly, alert, the wind cutting his face, the sound of his own breathing his only companion, until the light revealed the impossible. It wasn't one shape, it was two. A woman lay on her side, skin as pale as the snow, dark hair frozen to her face. She wore what remained of a police uniform, torn and stained with blood already blackened by the cold, her hands bound behind her back with thick rope. Beside her was a large German shepherd, imposing even like that, its legs also tied, its body angled toward her as if still trying to protect her. When the light passed over the animal, a weak growl vibrated in its chest, a spark of life refusing to go out. The man immediately lifted his gaze, scanning the trees, searching for movement, a reflection, any sign they weren't alone, but the storm swallowed everything. Then he saw the paper nailed to a nearby pine and carefully tore it free. The black letters were crooked, furious, a clear message, a warning. This wasn't a robbery, it was a punishment, an execution left unfinished so the cold could do the rest. He crouched down, examined the bindings, and knew whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. The knots were clean, efficient, familiar. That was when he understood his leave was over. He pulled the knife from his boot and acted without overthinking it. First the dog, because an injured animal can be dangerous even unintentionally. He spoke to it softly but firmly, cut the ropes, and the shepherd barely moved. Then he went to the woman, freed her wrists marked by cold and rope, searched for a pulse. It was weak, but it was there. She was barely breathing, hypothermia already taking hold. He looked toward the cabin and knew he couldn't carry both at once. The snow was already up to his ankles and the wind showed no mercy. He took off his own coat and wrapped it around her, lifted the dog with effort, heavy, limp, but he had carried men like that before, took it to his truck, and laid it on a blanket in the back seat. He ran back for the woman, who was already almost disappearing under the fresh snow, lifted her carefully, fragile, and murmured for her to hold on. He placed her beside her canine partner and started the engine, the headlights carving a desperate tunnel through the white as he drove back to the cabin. He brought them in one by one, the dog by the fire, the woman on the couch, and suddenly the refuge he had chosen to escape the world filled with the smell of blood, wet fur, and wood smoke. He worked quickly and with focus, pulled out his advanced first aid kit, heated water, cut away soaked clothing. The cold was the priority. The woman had a deep cut on her forehead, a dislocated shoulder, and bruises that spoke of more than a fall, a slow, intentional beating. The dog had a superficial gunshot wound in its side, which he cleaned while speaking to it calmly, as if it understood every word. Then, when the silence was broken only by the fire and the wind outside, someone knocked on the door, a firm, confident knock. His hand went straight to the shotgun. He looked through the peephole and recognized the local park ranger, one of the few people who knew about the cabin. He let her in, and she understood everything with a single glance at the scene. She didn't ask unnecessary questions. She knelt beside the dog and offered help, saying she had better veterinary equipment in her truck and could go get it even as the storm roared, and she returned as promised, covered in snow, stitching the animal's wound with skilled hands while explaining that for months she had been noticing strange things in the park, heavy trucks on closed roads and nighttime movements no one ever investigated. As they worked together, the dog began to wake, lifting its head to look for the woman on the couch and letting out a low whine, loyal even on the edge of death. And hours later, while the storm still battered the walls as if trying to force its way inside, the woman opened her eyes, confused and frightened at first until she saw the dog alive, and that relief anchored her back to reality. She asked for her phone and realized it was gone, then, in a weak but steady voice, introduced herself as a detective and confessed that she had been undercover for months investigating a criminal network using the mountains to move weapons and drugs, that she had gathered evidence, names, everything, and that night had been a trap. They had interrogated her, shot her dog in front of her to break her, and when it didn't work, left her there as a message, assuring her that someone inside the police was protecting those men. As she spoke, the man who had come seeking peace understood that the war hadn't stayed behind. It had only changed scenery, and when the storm ended and dawn covered the mountains in an icy silence, there was no turning back, because without many words or speeches it became clear that what had begun that night would not end there. Dawn arrived without a sound, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath, and though the storm had eased, the cold was still lodged in the bones, a clean, cruel cold that made the snow crunch underfoot, and inside the cabin the atmosphere was tense and heavy, not from fear but from the uncomfortable sense that something big was already in motion. He spent much of the night without sleep, watching the fire, checking bandages, making sure they were both still breathing, and when the sun began to filter through the pines, he made the decision none of them dared say out loud. The detective could barely move, her shoulders still out of place and every breath reminding her of the beating, but her eyes were no longer those of a victim. They were the eyes of someone reconstructing events piece by piece in her mind, and she insisted on returning to the place where it had all happened, not out of stubbornness but because she knew the snow could be an ally for a few more hours, preserving tracks, mistakes, details her attackers thought erased. The ranger hesitated, knowing how dangerous it was, but also knowing that ignoring what was happening in her territory made her complicit, and he didn't argue much. Simply set clear rules. Move slowly, stay alert, don't separate. Because even though he was on leave, his mind had already returned to that cold, precise state that doesn't accept improvisation. The dog was the first to stand, limping, body stiff but alert, as if it understood this wasn't over yet, and they walked among the trees following the blurred memory of the previous night, and what to an untrained eye was just untouched snow began to tell a different story to them. A half-buried shell casing, small, almost invisible, a strip of black industrial tape. Caught on a low branch, minimal remnants that spoke of trained men who had still made mistakes. The dog reacted first, sniffing insistently near a pine, pawing at the snow until it uncovered a piece of coarse fabric soaked in a chemical smell that didn't belong to the forest, which the ranger recognized immediately, having smelled it before near an abandoned mine on the park's northern boundary, a place that had always generated rumors and that no one seemed interested in investigating thoroughly. Back at the cabin, with maps spread across the table and the few clues laid out like fragile pieces, reality finally settled in. It wasn't just an isolated assault or an improvised group, there were routes, fixed points, internal protection, and the detectives said it plainly. They couldn't trust their own department, not yet, because the person who had handed her over was still inside, with a badge and access to sensitive information. The silence that followed was heavy, not with doubt but with understanding, because he had seen that kind of network before in other countries under other names, always protected by the same ingredient, fear, and the ranger was the first to break it, saying she couldn't keep pretending she saw nothing, that those mountains were her home and she wasn't going to allow them to be used as a hiding place. He nodded slowly, because even though he had come looking for peace, he understood better than anyone that there is no real rest when you know someone else is being hunted. The cabin stopped being a refuge and became a starting point. During the day they analyzed routes, schedules, behaviors. They spoke little and thought a lot. The detective remembered a warehouse on the outskirts of town, seemingly abandoned but with nighttime activity, trucks coming and going without raising suspicion. They couldn't go in head-on, not yet. They needed to observe, confirm, understand how things moved without triggering alarms. He suggested something simple: blend in, go unnoticed, act like any other visitor drawn by the landscape after the storm. It wasn't a heroic plan, it was a realistic one. As evening fell, the town began to come back to life. Tourists walking along the main street, cafes open, laughter, perfect postcards hiding what moved underneath. From inside a truck parked at a distance, they watched the warehouse. Nothing seemed out of place, lights off, doors closed, but the dog tensed, the same reaction he'd had the night of the attack. Hours later, a truck appeared, unmarked, unhurried, followed by another. They didn't unload in sight, made no noise, everything was quick and clean. The detective noted times, movements, tiny details, while the pain in her shoulder made itself known with every passing minute. When they returned to the cabin, there were no doubts. The puzzle was starting to fit together, and even without names, they knew where to look. That night no one spoke about fear, but everyone felt it, not as something that paralyzes, but as a constant pressure that forces you to stay awake. He cleaned his weapon in silence, not out of immediate intent but out of habit, because he knew what was coming wouldn't be resolved with calls or reports. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again, softer this time, like a warning. The detective looked at the dog sleeping near the fire and understood she had survived for more than just luck. The ranger checked her radio, aware that using it too much could give them away. And he, standing by the window, finally accepted that war doesn't always end when you leave the battlefield. Sometimes it just changes language, scenery, rules, and that second night in the mountains made it clear they were no longer just witnesses, they were part of the problem for someone else, which meant sooner or later, someone would come looking for them. The third night was the quietest of all, not because the danger had passed, but because when something truly approaches, the environment seems to hold its breath, and that false calm was what finally confirmed their suspicions. The truck moved again before dawn, this time along a secondary route the ranger knew by heart, an old road covered in snow and branches that led straight to the abandoned mine. They didn't improvise, didn't rush, they simply followed the plan they had built with patience, keeping their distance, using the terrain to their advantage, because they knew the smallest mistake could cost them everything. From a natural rise they watched several men get out of the vehicle, armed, organized, unhurried, going in and out of the tunnel as if they had been doing it for years. The detective clenched her jaw as she recognized patterns she had seen before, the same logistics, the same cold order that leaves no room for chance. The dog, despite the injury, stayed alert and motionless, tracking every movement with absolute focus. There was no doubt. That was the operations center, the point that connected everything. The ranger took photos from afar, not too many, just enough, knowing each image was a gamble. When one of the men broke away from the group to smoke, it became clear they weren't common criminals. His posture, the way he held the weapon, everything spoke of prior training, and that made the knot in the stomach tighten even more. They couldn't intervene, not yet, not with the detective injured and without solid backup, so they pulled back with the same care they had used to approach, storing every detail in memory. Back at the cabin, the decision became inevitable. They couldn't go to the local police, and they couldn't keep going alone for much longer. He was the one who said it plainly. He had seen this before, and when structures are rotten from the inside, the only way to move them is from the outside. He proposed contacting a federal unit he still had ties with, people who didn't answer to the local chain and who understood the language of that kind of organization. The detective hesitated for only a second, not out of distrust but pride. Accepting help meant admitting her world was more compromised than she wanted to believe, but in the end she nodded, because what was at stake was no longer her career, it was the lives of many others. The call was brief and direct, no unnecessary names, just facts, locations, and the keyword that opened doors. The wait was long and tense, marked by every outside noise, every shadow among the trees. They knew that once the message started moving, the others would begin to sense that something was off. And they did. That same night, lights appeared near the cabin, engines shut off at a distance, footsteps that didn't try too hard to stay hidden. He turned off the interior lamps and prepared the house the way he had learned years earlier, not to withstand a long siege, but to buy time. The ranger took position with a calm that was surprising, and the detective, her arms still immobilized, held her ground, gripping the weapon with her good hand, without trembling. The first shot shattered the silence like a dry clap of thunder, and everything accelerated. It wasn't a long or chaotic battle. It was brief and brutal: shouts, short commands, the dog moving forward when necessary, defending without hesitation. The attackers hadn't expected organized resistance, much less that level of response. When the sirens were finally heard in the distance, the mountain's echo carried something like relief. The men who had come to finish the job had no choice. Some fled, others fell, and those who remained understood too late that the cabin was not an easy target. With the arrival of federal forces, everything moved fast. They secured the area, took control of the mine, seized weapons, documents, and records that confirmed what the detective had risked her life to prove. Names began to surface, not only of criminals but of officials, mid-level commanders, key pieces who for years had looked the other way. The town woke up to a reality that never appeared on postcards, and while many feigned surprise, others felt something close to relief. Days later, when the mountain returned to its normal rhythm, the cabin regained its silence, but it was no longer the same. The detective was transferred to receive proper care and continue the process, not as a victim, but as a central figure in a larger investigation. The ranger returned to her routine, knowing her territory was a little cleaner, though never completely safe. He stayed a few more days, not because he needed rest, but because he needed to close the circle. One morning, as the sun lit the untouched snow, he understood something he hadn't wanted to accept before. Peace isn't always found by running away. Sometimes it comes after facing what catches up with you. When he finally left Silver Ridge, it wasn't with the feeling of having won, but with the certainty of having done the right thing. And although he knew the world would remain a violent and complex place, he also knew that, at least that time, in that cold corner of the mountains, someone didn't die in the snow, and that, for someone who had seen too much, was enough.